December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Temperature, -12 degrees Celsius. Corporal William Marsh crouched in a shell crater that smelled of wet pine and cordite, his medical kit pressed against his ribs. Around him, the snow had turned grey from ash and burnt powder. The forest canopy above was broken, splintered by artillery that had been falling since dawn. He could hear the low groan of wounded men scattered across the hillside, their voices blending with the wind. Marsh was 23 years old. He had been a medic with the 106th Infantry Division for 9 weeks. He had seen frostbite, shrapnel wounds, burns from white phosphorus. He had learned to work quickly, to ignore the shaking in his hands, to keep his voice calm even when the man in front of him was dying. But nothing had prepared him for this. The division had been encircled. 3 German panzer divisions had broken through the American lines in a coordinated assault that shattered the quiet sector like glass. Communication lines were cut, supply routes overrun. The 106th, green and undertrained, had been pushed into a narrow valley surrounded by ridges held by enemy machine gun nests and mortar teams. 500 men, no air support, no resupply, and the cold was killing as many soldiers as the guns. Marsh adjusted the strap of his canvas bag and moved toward the nearest voice. A private from Ohio lay against a fallen tree, his left leg twisted at an unnatural angle. The man's breath came in short bursts, visible in the frozen air. Marsh knelt beside him, unwrapped a bandage from his kit, and began stabilizing the fracture with a wooden splint scavenged from a shattered rifle stock. "Am I going home?" the private asked. Marsh didn't answer. He tied the splint tight, checked the circulation in the man's toes, and moved to the next soldier. By nightfall, Marsh had treated 19 men. Fractures, puncture wounds, hypothermia, shock. He had used most of his morphine syrettes. His fingers were numb inside his gloves. His boots were soaked through. And still, the groaning continued across the hillside, a chorus of pain that never stopped. The battalion commander, Major Calloway, gathered the remaining officers in a dugout carved into the frozen earth. Marsh was called in to report casualty numbers. He stood at the entrance, snow melting on his shoulders, and delivered the count in a flat voice. 43 wounded who can't walk, another 60 with frostbite or infection. We're out of plasma, out of sulfur powder. Bandages are running low. Calloway, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, stared at the map spread across a crate. Red marks indicated German positions on 3 sides. Blue marks showed their own shrinking perimeter. "How long can the wounded last without resupply?" Calloway asked. Marsh hesitated. He thought of the private with the broken leg, the sergeant with shrapnel in his chest, the rifleman whose feet had turned black from frostbite. 2 days. "Maybe less." Calloway nodded slowly. "Then we hold for 2 days." Marsh returned to the crater. He wrapped himself in a wool blanket and sat with his back against the frozen dirt. Around him, the forest was silent, except for the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle or the distant rumble of artillery. He closed his eyes and tried to remember what warmth felt like, but sleep didn't come. Instead, he thought about the numbers: 500 men, 2 days, and no way out. The temperature dropped further as night deepened. Marsh could hear men coughing in the darkness, the wet rattle of fluid in damaged lungs. He knew what that sound meant: pneumonia, exposure, the body shutting down one system at a time. He pulled the blanket tighter and tried not to think about home, about his mother's kitchen in Vermont, about the wood stove that kept the house warm even in the deepest winter, about the smell of coffee and bread. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else. The next morning, the German artillery began again. It started with a high whistle, followed by the concussive thump of impact. Trees exploded into splinters. Snow erupted in black fountains. Men screamed and dove for cover. Marsh pressed himself into the crater and counted the seconds between shells. 7 seconds. 6. 5. When the barrage stopped, he climbed out and ran toward the new casualties. A sergeant lay face down in the snow, his helmet blown off, his back riddled with shrapnel. Marsh rolled him over and checked for a pulse. Nothing. He moved to the next man. A private, younger than Marsh, clutching his stomach. Blood seeped through his fingers. Marsh cut open the uniform, packed the wound with gauze, and injected the last morphine syringe into the man's thigh. "Stay still," Marsh said. "Now you're going to be fine." The private nodded, his eyes already glassy. Marsh knew he was lying. By midday, the count had risen to 68 wounded. Marsh's kit was nearly empty. He had torn strips from his own undershirt to use as bandages. He had boiled snow in a helmet to clean wounds. He had whispered reassurances he didn't believe. And then the infections began. The cold slowed bleeding, but it also invited gangrene. Wounds that should have healed festered in the frozen air. Men who had survived shrapnel died from sepsis. Marsh watched it happen again and again. A soldier would seem stable in the morning, fevered by afternoon, dead by nightfall. He tried everything he had been taught. He cleaned wounds with iodine. He elevated limbs to reduce swelling. He rationed the remaining sulfur powder, sprinkling it into the worst injuries. But it wasn't enough. The bacteria spread faster than he could fight it. On the third day, a lieutenant named Brennan approached Marsh in the dugout. Brennan was a logistics officer, thin and sharp-eyed, the kind of man who counted bullets and calculated odds. "We need to talk about triage," Brennan said. Marsh looked up from the bandage he was rewrapping. "What about it?" "You're wasting supplies on men who won't make it." Marsh's jaw tightened. "I'm treating everyone who needs treatment." Brennan crouched beside him, lowering his voice. "We don't have enough for everyone. You know that. If you keep burning through bandages and plasma on the critical cases, the men who could survive won't have anything left." Marsh didn't respond. He tied off the bandage and moved to the next soldier, but Brennan's words stayed with him. That night, as he sat in the crater and listened to the groaning, he thought about the mathematics of survival. 500 men, 68 wounded, supplies for maybe 30. If he kept treating everyone equally, they would all die. If he chose, some might live. It was a calculation that made his stomach turn. The next morning, Marsh made a list. He divided the wounded into 3 categories: those who would survive with minimal care, those who needed immediate intervention, and those who were beyond saving. He placed the list in his pocket and didn't look at it again. But the pattern continued. Every day, more men were wounded. Every day, more men died. And every day, Marsh felt the weight of his choices press down on him like the frozen earth above the dugout. By the 5th day, he had stopped counting. A corporal named Davies from Pennsylvania stopped him near the makeshift aid station. Davies had been helping carry wounded men from the perimeter to the dugout, his hands blood-stained, his face hollow with exhaustion. "How many are we losing to infection?" Davies asked. Marsh didn't meet his eyes. "Too many. There's got to be something we can do." "There isn't." Davies grabbed his arm. "You're the medic. You're supposed to know." Marsh pulled away. "I'm supposed to have supplies. I'm supposed to have backup. I'm supposed to have a field hospital within 10 miles. I don't have any of that." Davies stared at him for a long moment, then walked away without another word. That night, Marsh sat alone in the crater and wondered if he had made a mistake, if he should have tried harder, if he should have thought of something, anything. The groaning continued in the darkness, and the cold pressed down like a hand over his mouth. On the 6th morning, Marsh found a German medical kit. It was lying in the snow near the edge of the perimeter, half buried beneath the body of an enemy soldier who had been killed during a night raid. Marsh approached carefully, checked the body for booby traps, and lifted the canvas bag. Inside, bandages, antiseptic, morphine ampules, sulfur tablets, and something else. A small glass vial labelled in German. Marsh held it up to the pale sunlight. The liquid inside was clear, viscous, slightly yellow. He didn't recognize it. That night, Marsh sat in the dugout with Lieutenant Brennan and a radio man named Cole. The three of them huddled around a candle stub, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Marsh placed the vial on the crate between them. "Anyone read German?" Marsh asked. Cole squinted at the label. "Looks like phenol, maybe chlorinated." "What's it for?" "Disinfectant, probably. Strong stuff. Germans use it in field hospitals." Marsh turned the vial in his fingers. "How strong?" Cole shrugged. "Strong enough to sterilize instruments, maybe strong enough to kill infection in tissue." Brennan leaned forward. "You're thinking about using it on the wounded?" Marsh didn't answer immediately. He thought about the men dying from gangrene, the black tissue spreading up limbs, the fever and delirium. He thought about the sulfur powder that had run out 3 days ago. "It's not approved," Brennan said. "I know. If it goes wrong, you could kill them faster." Marsh set the vial down. "They're dying anyway." Brennan and Cole exchanged a glance. Outside, the wind howled through the broken trees. Inside, the candle flickered. "What do you need?" Brennan finally asked. Marsh thought for a moment. Water, boiled, a syringe, and someone to hold the patient down. The next morning, Marsh chose his first subject. Corporal Davies, 26 years old, from Pennsylvania. Davies had taken shrapnel to the thigh 4 days earlier. The wound had been cleaned and bandaged, but infection had set in. The tissue around the injury was swollen, discolored, leaking pus. Davies was feverish, semi-conscious, mumbling about his wife. Marsh knelt beside him in the dugout and unwrapped the bandage. The smell was immediate, sweet, rotten, unmistakable. Gangrene. Left untreated, Davies would be dead by nightfall. Marsh opened the German vial and diluted the contents in a cup of boiled water. He didn't know the correct ratio. He guessed 1 part chemical to 10 parts water. He drew the mixture into a syringe scavenged from his kit. Brennan and Cole held Davies by the shoulders. Marsh positioned the syringe above the wound. "If this kills him," Brennan said quietly, "it's on all of us." Marsh didn't respond. He pressed the needle into the infected tissue and slowly injected the solution. Davies screamed, his body convulsed, his back arching off the ground. Brennan and Cole struggled to hold him down. Marsh withdrew the syringe and pressed a clean bandage over the wound. Davies thrashed for another 10 seconds, then went limp, unconscious. Marsh checked his pulse, weak but steady. He wrapped the wound and sat back, his hands trembling. Brennan stared at him. "Now we wait," Marsh said. The hours that followed felt longer than any Marsh had experienced. He checked Davies every 30 minutes. Pulse, temperature, breathing rate. The corporal remained unconscious, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Brennan brought him coffee made from melted snow and grounds that had been used 3 times already. It tasted like dirt, but it was warm. "You think it'll work?" Brennan asked. Marsh stared at Davies. I don't know. What happens if it doesn't?" "Then we bury him with the others." Brennan sat down beside him. "You know they'll court-martial you if this goes wrong." Marsh nodded. "I know. So why risk it?" Marsh didn't answer for a long time. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because doing nothing is worse." 12 hours later, Davies woke. Marsh was sitting beside him, monitoring his breathing, when the corporal's eyes opened. Davies blinked, confused, and tried to sit up. "Easy," Marsh said, pressing a hand to his chest. "Don't move." Davies looked down at his bandaged leg. What did you do?" Marsh unwrapped the bandage carefully. The tissue around the wound was still discolored, but the swelling had reduced. The pus had stopped leaking. The smell was fainter. Davies stared at it. "It doesn't hurt as much." Marsh rewrapped the bandage and checked Davies's temperature with the back of his hand. The fever had broken. "You're going to be fine," Marsh said. By the end of the day, word had spread through the perimeter. The medic had used something, German medicine. It worked. Marsh treated 3 more men that night, a private with an infected hand, a rifleman with a puncture wound in his side, a machine gunner with frostbite that had turned septic. He diluted the solution, injected it into the tissue, and held them down while they screamed. 2 survived. 1 didn't, but the ratio was better than before. On the 8th day, the German assault intensified. Mortars fell in clusters, shaking the frozen ground. Machine gun fire raked the tree line. A panzer rolled to within 200 meters of the perimeter before a bazooka team knocked out its tracks. Marsh worked through the barrage, moving from man to man, injecting the solution into infected wounds, wrapping bandages, whispering reassurances. The private with the infected hand was the second to recover. His name was Miller, 19 years old, from Wisconsin. He found Marsh in the dugout on the 9th morning. "I can hold a rifle again," Miller said, flexing his fingers. Marsh looked at the hand. The swelling was gone. The skin was pale but healthy. "How does it feel?" "Stiff, but it works." Miller paused at the entrance to the dugout. "Thank you." Marsh nodded. Miller left to rejoin his squad. By the 9th day, the wounded who had been treated were sitting up, walking, holding rifles. Major Calloway pulled Marsh aside in the dugout. "What are you using?" Marsh handed him the empty vial. "German disinfectant, phenol-based, I think." Calloway studied the label. "Is it safe?" "No, but it works." Calloway was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Keep using it." That afternoon, Marsh found another German medical kit during a patrol of the perimeter. Inside were 2 more vials of the solution. He rationed them carefully, treating only the most severe infections, the ones that would otherwise be fatal. Each injection brought the same result: screaming, convulsions, unconsciousness. Then, hours later, improvement. Not everyone survived. A sergeant with an abdominal wound died despite treatment. A lieutenant with infected burns passed away in his sleep, but the survival rate climbed. 30% became 40, 40 became 50. On the 10th day, American forces broke through the encirclement. Armored columns pushed into the valley, bringing supplies, reinforcements, and medics with fully stocked kits. The siege was over. Of the 500 men trapped in the pocket, 412 walked out alive. Marsh stood in the snow, watching the trucks roll in, and felt nothing. No relief, no pride, just exhaustion. A major from the relief column approached him. "You the medic?" Marsh nodded. "We heard what you did. Saved a lot of men." Marsh looked at the trees, the craters, the frozen ground stained with ash and blood. "I did what I had to." The major handed him a clipboard. "Yeah, we need a full report. What you used, how you used it, results." Marsh took the clipboard. "When do you need it?" "Yesterday." Marsh sat down on a crate and began writing. His handwriting was shaky, his fingers still numb from the cold, but he documented everything: the vial, the dilution ratio, the injection method, the survival rate. He wrote for 2 hours, filling 3 pages with cramped text. When he finished, he handed the clipboard back to the major. "Good work, Corporal," the major said. "We'll get this to medical command." Marsh watched him walk away, then turned back to the perimeter. Davies was standing near the tree line, his leg bandaged but functional, talking with Miller. Both men were smiling. For the first time in 10 days, Marsh allowed himself to feel something. Not pride, not satisfaction, just relief. 3 weeks later, Marsh was called to a field hospital near Bastogne. A medical officer, a colonel with grey hair and wire-rimmed glasses, sat across from him at a wooden table. Between them lay Marsh's report, handwritten on salvaged paper, describing the use of the German disinfectant. "This is highly irregular," the colonel said. Marsh said nothing. You used an unidentified chemical on wounded soldiers without authorization, without testing, without understanding the potential side effects. Yes, sir. The colonel leaned back in his chair. How many men did you treat? 46. And how many survived? 41. The colonel was silent. Outside, the sound of truck engines and distant artillery drifted through the canvas walls. Finally, he spoke. Under normal circumstances, you'd be court-martialed. Marsh met his gaze. I understand. The colonel picked up the report and read it again. But these aren't normal circumstances, and 41 men are alive because of what you did. He set the report down and signed the bottom of the page. Your actions are being entered into the record as field expedient medical innovation. The chemical you used has been sent to a laboratory for analysis. If it proves effective, it may be added to standard medical kits. Marsh nodded. And if it doesn't? The colonel folded his hands. Then 41 men got lucky. Marsh was reassigned to a hospital unit in Belgium. He spent his days treating wounded soldiers brought in from the front lines. Frostbite, trench foot, shrapnel wounds, burns. The work was familiar, but the conditions were different. He had supplies now: plasma, sulfur powder, morphine, everything he had lacked in the pocket. But the faces haunted him. Davies, Miller, the sergeant who had died despite treatment, the lieutenant who had passed in his sleep. He saw them in every wounded soldier who came through the hospital tent. One evening, a nurse named Eleanor found him sitting outside, staring at the snow. You should eat something, she said. Marsh shook his head. Not hungry? She sat down beside him. I heard what you did, in the Ardennes. Marsh didn't respond. They're calling it a miracle, she continued. 41 men who should have died. Marsh looked at her. It wasn't a miracle. It was desperation. Eleanor studied his face. Does that make it any less important? Marsh didn't have an answer. In the spring of 1945, a directive was issued to all field medics in the European theatre. It described a new protocol for treating infected wounds in extreme conditions. The protocol referenced a phenol-based solution, diluted in sterile water, to be used only when sulfur powder was unavailable. The directive did not mention Marsh by name, but in field hospitals across France, Belgium and Germany, medics began carrying small vials of the solution in their kits. They called it the pocket treatment. Some called it Marsh's formula, though none of them knew where the name came from. The solution saved lives, not in dramatic numbers, but in steady increments. A soldier here, a pilot there, a tanker pulled from a burning vehicle. By the time the war ended, the solution had been used on more than 300 men. The survival rate was 62%, higher than sulfur powder alone, higher than anything else available in field conditions. Marsh never learned these numbers. He was discharged in August 1945 and returned to Vermont. He took a job as a pharmacist in a small town near the Canadian border. He married a schoolteacher named Helen. They had 2 children. He never spoke about the war. 20 years later, a military historian named Dr. Robert Hayes was reviewing declassified medical reports from the Second World War. Hayes was compiling a comprehensive study of battlefield medicine, focusing on innovations that had emerged from combat conditions. He had already documented the development of penicillin, the use of blood plasma, the refinement of triage protocols. Then he found a single line buried in a logbook from December 1944. Corporal Marsh, medic, 106th Infantry Division, improvised antiseptic treatment under siege conditions. Result: survival rate increased by 37%. Hayes cross-referenced the entry with other documents: supply logs, casualty reports, after-action summaries. Slowly, the story came together. A medic, a pocket, 500 men, a German vial. Hayes tracked down the laboratory analysis from 1945. The chemical had been identified as a chlorinated phenol compound, similar to modern antiseptics, but more concentrated. The report noted that the compound was highly effective against anaerobic bacteria and suitable for emergency field use. Hayes searched for Corporal William Marsh. Military records showed his discharge date, his hometown, his occupation after the war, but there were no interviews, no photographs, no medals. In 1965, Hayes wrote to the address listed in the records. The letter was returned, marked deceased. Marsh had passed away 3 months earlier from a heart attack. He was 44 years old. Hayes contacted Marsh's widow, Helen. She agreed to meet him at her home in Vermont. The house was small, tucked into a hillside surrounded by pine trees. Helen was a thin woman with grey hair and kind eyes. She led Hayes into the living room and offered him tea. "I didn't know my husband had been contacted by the military," she said. Hayes explained his research. The logbook, the laboratory report, the directive issued in 1945. Helen listened quietly. When he finished, she stood and left the room. She returned a moment later with a small wooden box. Inside were Marsh's dog tags, a Purple Heart he had never mentioned, and a folded piece of paper. Hayes unfolded it carefully. It was the list Marsh had made in the pocket. 3 columns, names divided by survival probability. "He kept this?" Hayes asked. Helen nodded. "I found it after he died. He never told me about it." Hayes studied the list. Some names were crossed out, others were circled. At the bottom, in small handwriting, was a note. 41 saved, 5 lost. Not enough. Helen poured the tea. Was what he did important? Hayes looked at her. He saved more than 300 lives. The protocol he developed is still used today. Helen stared at the list. He never talked about the war. I asked him once, and he said there was nothing worth remembering. Hayes folded the paper and placed it back in the box. He was wrong. In 1967, Hayes published his study. It included a chapter on improvised medical treatments, with a section devoted to Marsh's actions in the Ardennes. The chapter was 12 pages long, detailed and technical. The book was read by military historians, medical researchers, and veteran organizations, but it never reached a wide audience. Marsh's name remained obscure, buried in footnotes and appendices. In 2003, the United States Army Medical Department released a training manual on battlefield medicine. One section covered the use of antiseptics in field conditions. The manual included a brief historical note. The use of chlorinated phenol compounds in combat environments was pioneered during World War II by Corporal William Marsh, 106th Infantry Division, during the Battle of the Bulge. His improvised protocol resulted in a significant increase in survival rates among infected casualties. No photograph, no biography, just a single paragraph in a training manual, and a record of 500 men who should have died, but didn't. Today, in the archives of the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Maryland, there is a small glass vial labeled in German. Next to it is a faded note, handwritten on yellowed paper, found in Ardennes Forest, December 1944. Used by Corporal W. Marsh to treat 46 casualties. 41 survived. Analysis confirmed chlorinated phenol compound. Recommended for field use. The vial sits on a shelf between other artifacts from the war. A surgical kit from Normandy. A blood plasma container from Iwo Jima. A morphine syrette from the Rhine crossing. Few visitors notice it. Those who do read the note pause for a moment, then move on. But the vial remains, a reminder that in the chaos of war, in the frozen depths of a pocket surrounded by enemy forces, one medic refused to accept that 500 men had to die. He found a way, against protocol, against orders, against every rule in the medical handbook, and because of that refusal, 412 men walked out of the Ardennes alive. The official report, filed on January 15, 1945, concluded with a single line. Corporal Marsh's actions, while irregular, demonstrated exceptional medical judgment under extreme duress. His improvised protocol is recommended for further study and potential implementation. No mention of the screaming, no mention of the fear, no mention of the night spent sitting in a frozen crater, wondering if he had made the right choice. Just a line in a report, filed away, forgotten, until someone decides to remember.